House of Lords last night rejected a series of proposed measures in the government's police, crime, sentencing and courts bill, proposals to give you a flavour, for example, that would punish people who lock themselves onto objects with up to 51 weeks imprisonment up to. The government's framed it as necessary to tackle the likes of Extinction Rebellion and insulate Britain, but the critics, and they're out there, call it a crackdown on civil liberties and the top of a potentially very slippery slope when it comes to civil liberties that we all enjoy. Is the government simply helping working people avoid disruption, or are they claiming more control over our right to legally assemble and to protest? Well, joining me now, Mark Johnson, the Legal and Policy Officer at Big Brother Watch. Mark, thanks so much for your time. We've got these amendments, haven't we? So some of the checks and balances in the small hours of this morning from the revising chamber, from the House of Lords, thrown back to the Commons. There's a system that's sort of working there to some degree, at least.
That's right. Last night was a really big victory for civil liberties in this country, and it's been a very difficult few years in that regard. But this bill is the latest in a series of bills that is very authoritarian. It's really a protest crackdown bill, and it was a really good result for our rights and freedoms.
Mark, Mark, you'll know. You don't need me to tell you, but I'll tell you anyway. I mean, you know, many of our viewers take an absolutely contrary view. They say to see a repeat of some of what we saw last year, particularly around Insulate Britain, but not just Insulate Britain, but ambulances being stopped from going about their business, ferrying sick people to hospital, people chaining themselves, gluing themselves to the road, all the rest of it. And part of the problem there is that we're looking at a picture now, apologies to our radio listeners, of a white van parked up. We saw so many standoffs between members of the public, who could have intervened, could have wrenched people away and torn off their skin from their hands that was glued to the ground. But they sign up to that unwritten contract between the governed and those who do the governing, which is that we contract out our policing to other people. But that was coming under real strain last year, it seems to a lot of people. So the government had to do something.
A lot of the behaviour that you're talking about there is largely covered by existing criminal offences. So, for example, obstructing a public highway is a criminal offence, obstructing an emergency services vehicle is a criminal offence. And what's not clear is that bringing in a raft of new measures that would actually have a big impact on the right to peaceful protest, whether that would be necessary or proportionate. Some of the measures that you spoke about previously included, clamping down on peaceful protests where they're deemed to be too noisy, or making it more difficult to protest in Parliament Square. That's not necessary. That's not proportionate, and effectively, it's just
I know people.
On peaceful protests.
Sorry to interrupt. The point about noise is made a lot, isn't it? But I'm just looking at some of those amendments last night. Things like disrupting infrastructure. I mean, that could be an airport, but it could be a printing press for a newspaper. I mean, that was rejected by peers. We've got Lord Paddock last night, maybe the early hours of this morning, saying this government bill is reminiscent of Cold War Eastern Bloc police states. Come on.
What I would say, more than anything else, is that in trying to bring those measures in, some of the measures that you've spoken about there, about obstructing infrastructure, these were a set of amendments that the government tried to bring in right at the very end of the process. The bill had already been all the way through the House of Commons. It was most of the way through the House of Lords, and they tried to bring in around 10, 12 new amendments that would radically alter how policing and protest work in this country. And regardless of what you think of them, that's not an adequate way to make law. But by no means is that an adequate way to make law. But when you look at the provisions in more detail, they were drafted in an incredibly broad way. You mentioned something like locking on. I mean, that's drafted in a way that could actually criminalise people who are linking arms. So the measures deserve much more scrutiny than they were afforded. It was a cynical attempt to railroad these measures in last minute. And actually, the wider impact would be on people who were exercising their legitimate right to peaceful protest.
Mark Johnson from Big Brother Watch. Mark, appreciate your time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.